Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. This is Firoz Manji from Daraja Press. Welcome to today's launch of the extraordinary book, Partisan Universalism, Essays in Honor of Ato Sekyi-Otu. The music that you've just heard is by Amira Kher, Sudanese singer, songwriter, producer, included here with kind permission from Amira. The song is entitled Samiri, Kindred Spirit. You can find more about her outstanding music on Spotify and many other platforms. Today we have the book launch that is going to be moderated by Lewis Gordon, philosopher extraordinary at the University of Connecticut, who I'm sure many of you already know. Our guests today include Patrick Taylor, Emeritus Professor at York University. We're hoping to have Nergis Canefe from York University, Susan Brophy, a PhD student in social and political thought at York, Michael Neocosmos, Emeritus Professor at the university known as Rhodes, and Gamal Abdel-Shehid, who edited this volume with Sofia Noori. And we're honored, of course, to have Ato join us today for this event. Ato, as many of you will know, is Emeritus Professor in the Department of Social Science and Graduate Program in Social and Political Thought at York University. He is the author of two extraordinary groundbreaking books, Fanon's Dialectics of Experience and Left Universalism, Africacentric Essays. Welcome, all of you, to today's launch. Over to you. Let me pass the baton on to Lewis.
Okay. So, Hotep, everybody. I would also like to add to that, Etisen, Maha,
Boho,
yeah, Baho, Madwu, Eko Osan, and of course, given the time difference, Eko Ale, and also Vanikam, and welcome to all. This is an auspicious occasion. We're celebrating this volume in honor of the beloved, the great Ato Sekyi-Otu. And I should like to add to this that one of the things when we had our celebratory meeting at York University, I reflected upon was when I first met our esteemed elder. This is before we had the whole situation with the internet where you could get to see everybody. You have all these images. And Ato was reading my books and I was reading his work. And I was invited to York University. And when I showed up, Ato was trying to find out where was Professor Gordon because he was looking for this. He thought he was reading an elder. And I've reflected over the years. My mother used to quip that. She used to say to me, my family called me Rick. And she'd say, Rick, why are all your friends so much older than you? And the thing I've learned over the years is that people who are old when they're young tend to be young when they're older. And I bring this up mainly because as everyone looks at the screen, although at that time I was in my 30s, now it's much later. Interestingly enough, if you look at the screen, Ato is a young man.
Yeah.
We have become the same age. In fact, I don't know. Something's happened. I think I'm looking a little older than you, Ato. But that's the whole point. The idea, the vivacity of ideas, the vibrancy of it, the connection to it. When we're really thinking, we're connected across generations. And it is with that in mind that we understand what it is when our earliest of ancestors reached out to us across time and have bestowed upon us this obligation to continue doing so. And so it's with great celebration that the community has come together today for this celebration. And thank you, many of you who are in the audience who have also joined us. It is such a pleasure, such an honor to meet in this moment where we could also, and since this was connected through Daraja Press, and also with our esteemed colleague Feroz Manji, I could add some Swahili and just simply say Ujambo. So with that, yes, and as you could see, I'm also in honor making sure I got my kente here, because I have my my brethren from Ghana, though this is from South Africa. What I'm wearing, it was a gift to me from Maboko More, and the thing, the thing about this, I could say Domela to him, and also to some of my South African brethren and sistren, Sawubona. And I said Vanakam as well, because as some of you know, my background is also Tamil. And I had to, for Olúfémi Taiwò here, made my effort at Yoruba. So without further ado, because we have limited time, we'd like to go into, we're going to get into the session, because we're looking forward to hearing from our esteemed elder and also young man, Ato Sekyi-Otu. But before that, I'm sure Feroz would like to say something, and then we will get the moderation going. So Feroz, would you like to make a remark?
Thank you. Very briefly, I mean, I'd like to pay my respects and thanks to Gamal Abdel-Shehid and Sofia Noori, with whom we worked over many months to have this particular book appear. I think they've done a heroic piece of work. It took a while to get all the other authors whipped into shape, but I think they did a great job in doing so. And quite honestly, to have had the opportunity to publish a book that celebrates one of the world's great philosophers, Ato Sekyi-Otu, is really, really important. And I'm very grateful to colleagues at the University of York, York University, and Sofia Noori, who's now at UBC, that they brought this book to us. So let me leave it at that point. And Ato, a very warm welcome. It's a real pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you so much. A pleasure indeed, a pleasure indeed. And so we will go straight to it. Why don't we begin right away with Professor Olúfémi Taiwò. Femi, the screen, if we were live, I'd say the floor or the podium, but the screen is yours.
Oh, I thought Ato was going to start.
Oh, no, we're going to start with each of you, because that way there'll be a little more time for Ato.
Okay, no problem. First, I would like to thank Gamal Abdel-Shehid and Sofia Noori for their stewardship of this, to me, very important book. And I say it's important only because I'm in it, so that's, But on a serious note, it's a very important book, regardless of my status. And to Feroz Manji and Dialectic Press for publishing it. Feroz, this is getting to be a habit now, but please keep it up. So, but I would also like to salute and thank Professor Ato Sekyi-Otu for doing the kind of work that gave us all an opportunity to have something to dilate upon that does not consist of chasing slides and guilt-tripping our supposed interlocutors. And I say this deliberately on this occasion as a kind of introduction to a piece of polemic that I'm finishing as we speak, directed against what I call the decolonizing industry that has taken over Africa and is literally channeling the energies of young people away from substantive thinking to just chasing the latest slides from people that they think, really are dissing Africa. Had Ato done the same thing, I am convinced the conference from which this book arose would not have attracted the energies of somebody like me, and I can say for many of us, who are present at that conference, because, we really had something substantive to sink our teeth into. We had concrete issues, for us to be able to move forward and talk about real themes rather than derivative themes that are attached to what others have said or not said about Africa. My contribution to the book is actually the second part of a long paper that I broke into two, dealing with the much vaunted dominance of communitarianism as Africa's preferred social ontology and political philosophy. And I hate to do this, I will not mention the journal, but the original paper was actually dismissed by one of the reviewers for the journal, which is based in Africa, as a rant. So I want to thank Gamal and Sofia for publishing the second half of the rant. So at least the world will now be in a position. And this is important to me because, the issue of communitarianism continues to be flogged as if you did not buy into communitarianism, there's something that is wrong with your Africanness. But because I don't do identity, and I make it clear to everybody, I don't do identity because identity is a part of death. It's like the ego for the individual. And once people do that, you really can never be African enough for them. They just keep shifting the goalposts in order for you to jump through more hoops to prove that you're a genuine African. And my answer to people usually is to say, take the label, I'll keep the idea. I'd rather be human than be African. And the whole point of the debate for me about communitarianism has to do with some of the fundamental questions of philosophy. Who are we? What do we owe one another? How should we organize society? What's the best life for humans? And those questions do not come with any geographical boundaries. They do not come with any cultural boundaries. We can only talk about how each historicity, which every civilization is, tries to answer those perennial questions and offer those answers to the rest of the world, to learn from them, from their answers. Incidentally, Sekyi-Otu also, in his latest book, considers the same subject matter. And he and I happen to have different reads of the central character in the paper, which is Kwame Gyekye's, defense of what he called moderate communitarianism. But what is important to me and what is more significant is the shared motivation for our divergent reflections. And that is the fate of the individual in Africa and the place of individualism in its many iterations in African philosophical discourses. Many of those who argue for communitarianism have a very cavalier attitude towards the whole question of individualism. And as far as I'm concerned, that is not designed to expand thought. It is actually designed peremptorily to stop serious and significant inquiry. And I think it's a shame that too many of our young people in the continent are losing on that score. And I will share a sad story with you that almost brought me to tears. At one of our universities in the continent, I will not name which one, I got an email from somebody who just wrote a doctoral dissertation, who said to me, I agree with what you had to say in Africa Must Be Modern, but I cannot go the whole hog in my dissertation because I'm afraid that I will not pass.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness.
I am not kidding you. And the person went on to say, it looks to me as if individualism is a red flag for many of my teachers. And anybody who says that for them, has no reason for being. That is where we are right now. And I know the university, I know the department. I did not ask the person for who is directing the dissertation, but I have a feeling that I know them. Those who wish to engage this topic will do well to walk through the postscript to chapter 4 in left universalism, Africacentric essays. And I mentioned the postscript because what Ato does in there is really to bring this down to a granular level, both of his own family experience, of social life in Ghana, of the musical arts, and of what happens when you bring all these things together, trying to navigate the intricacies of individualism and collectivism, rather than just taking this one position and making it seem as if Africa has that issue resolved and there's nothing for us to worry about. Unfortunately, almost all who defend communitarianism never do anything to get to the granular, the way that Ato does in that postscript. In fact, that postscript, I'm saying to all of you, is worthy of very serious study and engagement for all of us who live in other areas to see how the themes that are articulated there are represented for us in our own locality. I do this all the time. Maybe that's why it resonated with me as much as it did, but I don't think that that is something. People talk nebulously about Africa this, Africa that. They never attach it to any serious, cultural tradition, discursive tradition. And when they do, they just literally panel beat, flatten everything into a shade of gray. And I don't think there's much illumination that comes from there. But of course, they know their audience, and that audience remains committed to being titillated by Africa rather than educated by it. As for me, I continue to rivet my attention on substantive African philosophy, treating of themes like individualism, liberal democracy, being, ethics, and so on, that remain the warp and woof of philosophers everywhere. This I do without any embrace of what I call the metaphysics of difference, or dissemination of my interlocutors of gross misrepresentations of African modes of being human, denominated by an appeal to cheap but always spurious authenticity, designed to constrict rather than expand the universe of our discourse. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Well done, Femi. Well done.
Well done, Femi. Well done.
Ooh.
Excellent.
Yes,
Excellent. Unsurprisingly excellent.
Thank you.
Okay, we have some feedback.
Okay, we have some feedback.
Is this you, Patrick?
Yeah, are you hearing me okay?
Okay. Well, I think what we should do is move now to Patrick Taylor. So Patrick, could you proceed? And then when you're done, mute your mic.
When you're done, mute your mic.
Are you hearing me okay?
No, there's a lot of feedback. I think Ato should mute as
Can you hear
well.
me?
It's okay now. It's okay, yeah.
Ato has to mute, I believe. Can you mute? Okay, Ato's muted. Okay, I'm gonna mute.
Okay. Thank you, Louis, and thanks, Feroz, for bringing this terrific book out. Certainly, it's an honor to be part of this, and I'm particularly grateful to Sophia and to Gamal for all the work you put into organizing the event, which allowed us to honor Ato, who's so important to so many of us, and for the work you did actually getting this edited and getting it out in such an efficient way. Really appreciate that. I especially want to thank Ato for making this possible. Without you, Ato, I mean, this is it's just fantastic that you that you are who you are, that you've made it possible for us to be here, to gather together, to celebrate your work. What stands out for me about this collection as a whole is the breadth of it, the depth of it, and just the reflection of it is on Ato's work, on the breadth and depth of Ato's work as a whole. And I think Professor Taiwò just indicated that, just the depth and breadth of Ato's work. The essays speak to the generative nature of Ato's thought, from the social sciences to the humanities, from philosophy to literature. And again, Professor Taiwò hinted at this in his presentation too. They move geographically from Africa to the Americas, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And all of this is generative out of Ato's thought, you know, and to me, that's just fantastic. And throughout all this, we see the importance of the idea of contextual or situated critique, the topic of Ato's reflective and compelling essay in the volume. Ato states, and I quote, "Analogy is the crucible of connectedness, the necessary condition of universalizing ethical reasoning, the spark of seditious solidarity." Note the mischievous phrase there, the spark of seditious solidarity. That's vintage Ato. The individual, the community, the human. From our historical, situated positions, we have a duty to act as partisans responding, in his words, to the common pain of suffering humanity. My own engagement with Ato goes back to being, he was my supervisor for my PhD. And I am forever grateful for the intellectual and personal generosity. And I think generosity is a word that's really important when we think of what Ato has contributed to each of us as individuals and to thought in the broadest sense of the word. Ato, I was a young white student from the Caribbean, interested in Fanon and interested in Caribbean literature and culture. And Ato welcomed me and was a critical guide to me, provided me the mentorship that I needed, but the room for dialogue. And that's one of the wonderful things I think about, all of us know about Ato, the room for dialogue, the possibility of finding one's own way on a shared journey. Ato was and is inspirational. My own chapter in the collection it talks about the novel Washington Black by Ghanaian-Canadian Essie Edugian. And it's a work that tracks the peculiar journey to freedom of a young enslaved Black man, a journey that echoes through the centuries: Garvey, Fanon, Marley, Floyd, ceaselessly invoking the emancipatory quest, creativity, an immense possibility that is the human in all his, her, or their particularity. If Washington Black's journey from Barbados to Canada takes me back to my own problematic Barbadian heritage, Edugian's work, like Ato's, promises the possibility of something different, becoming, in Ato's words, an invitation to remember severed but shareable things, the tears, but also the hopes and dreams. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Well done. Thank you. We now move to Susan Dianne Brophy. Could we bring Susan in?
Hello. Hi. Sorry. My camera is not functional for today. Just the perfect timing as usual. But thank you for making me be able to connect, at least by audio, and have the honor of joining this amazing panel to celebrate this book, really. I was introduced as a PhD student, and I'm going to be reflecting on my time as a PhD student. I happen to have not been a PhD student for about a decade now. I do happen to have a tenure position, so I'm going to reflect back on that. So I'm reliving it in a few ways, but it's obviously a great pleasure to be joining everybody today. And I'm going to pick up where Patrick left off, which is that last line from Ato's book, from his final paper that he gave at the end of the conference in October 2019, where he talks about remembering the severed but shareable things. And I was curious to listen to Patrick's interpretation of tears instead of tears, which I was wondering to whether or not we should be reading that as tears or tears. But I'm also reflecting on the hopes and dreams that is the SBT experience. So I'm going to go on a little bit of a journey through Dialectic of Experience and come back and picking up on themes from my contribution to this book. And one piece that I picked up on that's really definitive of my project while I was in SBT and my dissertation that I still come back to today is this passage, this little turn of phrase from the Dialectic of Experience, where Ato writes about the idolatry of the autonomous subject. And it became kind of shorthand for the critique that I undertake with respect to liberal democracy and settler colonialism. But for the occasion of today, I went back and I looked at the context within which Ato wrote this. And it's the third chapter, Bewildering Enlightenment, specifically page 128. And Ato writes in explaining Fanon, quote, avoids that idolatry of the autonomous subject in his account of class, while at the same time questioning the authenticity of class as a social form in the colonial world. For Fanon, writes Professor Sekyi-Otu, class, quote, describes not so much an objective determination as a mode of subjectivity, more or less inauthentic, heteronymous, and above all, lacking in the cognitive and moral capacities required to forge universalist ends out of particular interests. So at first I read this contingency of essentialism as the basis of the inauthenticity of class in the, quote, colonial world. And I also see this contingency of the essentialism in context of critique, Ato's essay in the collection, as a questioning of the classificatory use of race. However, we also continue to read and see in Ato's work the contingency of essentialism at the same time being a possibility of the partisan universal. It is that landscape, quote, of fertile complications, which is a quote that Professor Sekyi-Otu draws from Césaire, both in that third chapter I'm quoting from, as well as in the essay in the edited collection. So then we come around to the question, how do we attempt to realize this possibility? Around the time when Dialectic of Experience was published in the mid-90s, many people were moving towards this notion of an anarchic, prefigurative conception of subjectivity or a meaningless authenticity. But really that's an appeal to a Kantian unconditioned condition, which is just the breeding ground for that idolatry of the autonomous subject. Instead, Ato asks us to take seriously, and this is at 151 of Dialectic of Experience, the challenge of searching for the common good in the teeth of recognizable differences of social circumstance and principle. He refers to this later as an arduous labor, and this is the theme that I focus on in my contribution, my short contribution in Partisan Universalism, the edited collection from Gamal and Sofia. This idea of work as a theme, and I focus on it through social reproduction theory. But Ato writes about this as a historical transformation, writes about historical transformation as the work of the collective will. So the tools of this labor are cognitive and moral, or more precisely, as stated at page 128 of the Dialectic of Experience, they are the, quote, cognitive and moral capacities required to forge universalist ends out of particular interests. And I found this idea of the forging instructive, also in a kind of literal sense of forging as in a fabricating from the particularities, a common objective, something new and shared. This position offers no essential moralism or no specific political imperative, yet its particularist grounded universalist aim keeps it from being amoral or apolitical, not to mention, quote, irredeemably narcissistic. That's what it was like being in SBT. It was a space to build the cognitive and moral tools for forging. It was a partisan training ground. Terms of this partisanship differed, of course. For some, it was an introduction. For some, it was terminal. For some, it was low stakes. For some, it was high stakes. But many in SBT among my cohort were eager stand takers, purveyors of many an open letter, frontline picketers as well. Collegiality was learned later or elsewhere, perhaps as a dulling of the forger's tools through new professional class loyalties. So for me, SBT remains something of a dreamscape. It is both a reality and something of a dream, but it is always kind of a sphere of fertile complications. It's at the heart of my most important grad school friendships. It's also what I saw in action at Founders College back in October 2019, and it's alive again in this collection. So I just want to say thank you for Gamal for organizing that event, as well as Sofia for putting together this book with Gamal, and also obviously an enormous thank you, a tipping of the hat to Professor Sekyi-Otu for inspiring me to continue to keep my tools sharp, and to any former and current SBTers watching or listening in this case, check out this edited collection and forge on.
Well done. Thank you very much, Susan. And now we move to Nergis. Now, Nergis, I've never actually heard your last name, so it could be Canefe or Canefe, but to Nergis.
That's all right. It could be either. I'm sorry, I was caught in the snow to come back and made it on time. So I did not realize we are expected to make a formal presentation. And if it is the case, I think I can speak to some of the tenets of what caught my attention in terms of the overall gestures made by the volume. And but in particular, I'd like to talk about the notion of universalism. My brief contribution was related to the debate on Asian model production and social and political movements in the global South, and how what has been termed as the vernacular actually has a lot more currency than we attribute to it in seemingly unlikely circumstances in terms of organization of movements of resistance and as well as survival. And this particular debate on Asiatic model production and the historical uniqueness of societies in the global South and the long-standing suspicion that they have neither the potential nor the background for the formation of an adequate working class has been aiding me since my 20s, and I'm almost 100, so that's a very long time. And what really caught my attention over the decades, this debate being taken up in different venues, is there were two ways of addressing the potential conflict of interest that's emerging from this particular debate, the particularity of the global South, particularity of societies in Africa and Latin America, and Middle East and Asia, was that, well, they had a peculiar background, but that doesn't mean later on they didn't catch up and then they just have to go through the stages, so there's nothing to be upset about. Or the response was more akin to, and then this is more of the British Marxist response, suggesting that, well, you know, they'll have other ways of organizing and resisting the onset of historical capitalism in its most fierce forms, and it's just never going to be a full-fledged class struggle. And both of these answers I found really troubling because essentially the focus of a lot of my scholarship has been on mobilities and in particular forced migration, not south to north only, but also south-south. And my understanding has been perhaps a very Marcusian one, in the sense that working class formation cannot be dictated by methodological nationalism. And labor and exploitation has never in the history of capitalism recognized boundaries and then, to say the least, the national borders as some sort of a demarcation line in terms of who is to be exploited most and in what forms. And in fact, being stateless or being dispossessed or being on the move often present us the perfect circumstances for creating a laboring class which is uprooted and as the name suggests, dispossessed, and then therefore much more open to abuse and exploitation. And so I felt like in the larger scheme of things, this particular business of the limited potential of working classes or working people and dispossessed masses in the global south, in terms of organizing themselves into a veritable political actor on account of their historical specificity. Perhaps it's not something that we can blame Marx for, but certainly it was something that we needed to take issue with in the post-Marxist understanding of survival and resistance. And it's within that context I actually refer to Ato's notion of universalism, which is different than the standard left universalism debate. And I'm trying to get down to the very core of the city and agency of the subject, the historical subject, which is amorphed and which is basically silenced as a result of multiple layers of not just the result of
unfortunately, I think, I'm sorry, Nergis, we can't hear you. I think you paused. Can everybody else hear me?
Yes, I can.
But we can't hear Nergis.
We can't hear Nergis. Oh. Nergis, can you hear me trying to reach you? I think there may be a malfunction. Okay. Feroz, is there a way for you to reach her? Well, you'd have to unmute, Feroz.
I'll try and do so.
Yeah.
If we can't get her back, just to point that the cover of the book, the cover design was done by Nergis. So many.
Well done, Nergis.
Yeah.
And we're dealing with, it's interesting, we're dealing with the complexities of technology. And there are times, of course, at the nano level, and there are certain quantum elements in which we deal with the contingency and the uncertainty of the photon. I also do theoretical physics. But that said, because we're dealing with such contingencies, I don't want us to miss an opportunity to hear from the man we're honoring, our esteemed elder and young and man of youth. So without further ado, first, thank you again, Nergis. And without further ado, Atu, could you please unmute? Could you please unmute your mic?
Can you hear me?
Yes. So without further ado, to everybody, for those viewing live, everybody, our esteemed elder professor, the honorable, the beloved, Ato Sekyi-Otu.
Thank you, sir. Well, I'm enormously grateful and honored for this event and for the extraordinary essays you've all contributed to the volume. I must say a very special thank you to Gamal, Sofia, and Fanon for crafting this project and bringing it to fruition. Jane Anna Gordon's very generous blurb calls the book and your contributions a celebration of my work and the person I am. Of course, I'm grateful for that encomium. But I'd like to think that the book is a celebration of the twin vital principles and practices of individuality and connectedness made beautifully manifest in your marvelous essays. I thought of sending you a tune, but for fear of inflicting on you a rather inauspicious start to a conversation, I will not sing it, but simply echo the opening lines of John Lennon and Yoko Ono's play for understanding fundamentals, understanding the fundamentals of their fundamental project. You remember those lines. All we are saying is, I will not dwell on the substantive content of that play. Give peace a chance. For one thing, we who want to see this wicked world destroyed, comprehensively destroyed, cannot be fetishists of peace unmodified. What interests me is Yoko and John's invitation to get the basic meaning of their project right. So let it be with what we left universalists mean to say. All we're saying is this: our objections and protests as sentient beings against injury, and our proposals and projects for change, whether these are reformist, reparative, or revolutionary, harbor an appeal to universality. An appeal that may be avowed and explicit, or merely latent and implicit, but is most certainly unavoidable. A critical, even insurgent universality, to echo Massimiliano Tomba. Universality as thought and practice haunts and drives the languages of discontent. The protagonist in South African writer Bessie Hare's novel Maru poses this question: how universal is a language of oppression? All we are adding to that rhetorical question is this: how universal is a language of discontent and protest and revolt? To the Afro-pessimist argument that grammars of suffering are distinct and resist mutual translation, to the thesis that the Black grammar of suffering is radically different from and irreducible to any other grammar of suffering, certainly to the humanist narrative of suffering and redemption, we say with Fanon, all forms of exploitation are alike. All forms of exploitation are identical, for they all are directed at the same object, the human being. And we say that the thesis of radical particularity is contestable, and is contested not only on the part of external critics waving the cosmopolitan flag, or by native converts to an exogenous enlightenment. It is internally, essentially contestable on indigenous discursive grounds. All we are saying is that the most local, context-specific, particularistic protests against injury and proposals for redress ground their claims inescapably in the humanist universalism. Such, we argue, is the latent universalism of Black Lives Matter. That tacit universalism survives the strategic separatism adopted by some of the movement's protagonists, who insisted, for example, that sympathetic white demonstrators take a back seat. And it survives and must survive thanks to the only coherent, non-tautological answer to the following question: do Black lives matter because they're Black, or do they matter because they're human? We know the stakes that come with giving the only coherent answer: Black lives matter because they're human lives. That answer, we know, runs the risk of being invoked to defang the rhetoric of resistance by transmuting its insurgent partisanship into the syrupy generality of all lives matter. That is one possible use, or rather misuse, of the latent humanism of Black Lives Matter. Appropriation by a disingenuous and reactionary a-racialism that denies the specific gravity of the Black condition and the specific agency of the demands made in its name. Not only what right-wing Machiavellians do with Martin Luther King's prophetic demand, not by the color of their skin, twisting that demand into a history amnesiac, descriptive egalitarianism, and you are on your own baby individualism, in order to discredit affirmative action and other restitutive or reparative programs. But consider another appropriation in which universalist humanism, rather than displacing the idiom of Blackness, collaborates with that idiom, so that the two are conjointly retained and deployed otherwise. I'm referring to the 2020 explosion of demonstrations in Nigeria, which began as protests against brutal violence of the state apparatus, the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, and then aimed their discontent at social economic inequalities. Some of those demonstrators marched under the banner Nigerian Lives Matter, but also under the banner Black Lives Matter Everywhere. This in a country which is virtually all Black, and for that very reason does not normally call its citizens Black. A context, that is to say, where the principal contradiction, to use an old phrase, is not Black lives in relation to white supremacy and its repressive practices. Under these circumstances, why would the protesters invoke BLM not indeed as a literal assimilation, but as an analogical identification? Why would they do that? Were it not for the latent universalism that motivates BLM itself, sparks its discontent, and justifies its demands and aims in the first place? Today, more than ever, the necessity of the appeal to the universal as an internal weapon of criticism and justification, making that appeal explicit, is not just a matter of theory. As we gather here, a vicious bill called Draft Bill for the Promotion of Proper Human Sexual Rights and Ghanaian Family Values is before Ghana's parliament. It calls for the criminalization of the practice of homosexuality and even advocacy of the rights of homosexuals. Quite frankly, the bill licenses persecution. With impeccable logic, the Speaker of Parliament intones, "We will not legislate to infringe on the human rights of people, but we will legislate to ensure that culture and traditions are not violated." End of quote. What our culture and traditions are, what makes them praiseworthy, and how we are to promote them, all that is evidently exempt from the province of human rights. A prominent Catholic archbishop concurs. He accused the supporters of gay rights of being under the spell of postmodernist subjectivism and relativism, but then offers as an argument against gay rights the claim that they are incompatible with Christianity and Ghanaian culture. Is that the best argument you can offer, Holy Father, this quintessential resort to relativism, to the claims of a particular religious and cultural tradition, more precisely to a particular interpretation, one interpretation of those traditions, the unholy, forcible triumph of one interpretation. Is that the best you can do? Catholic prelate of all people, putative votary of the whole, tell us, Holy Father, the Christian values and Ghanaian traditions in the name of which you support that draconian bill, are they good and praiseworthy simply because they are Christian and allegedly all our own? There is a widespread intolerance and moral panic in the land, instigated by religious and secular elites and supported by large sections of the people, designed to deflect their revulsion and revolt against miserable conditions of existence. Against this moral tyranny dressed up as cultural piety, this Talibanism without the Taliban, only the appeal to the universal, one that asks in a native idiom, are we not also human beings? Only that appeal can protect and even save lives, human lives, in their black or white or African or protean incarnations. It is a matter of unleashing the human being. Thus spoke the young Fanon. Let the human be, let it be. That is all we are saying. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ato. Thank you so much. Thank you. For the audience, I'm holding up the book here. I had the honor and privilege of writing the afterword. And you notice I added that word privilege. Throughout this book, we've interrogated the misuse, the transformation, and abuse of language. And as we saw right now in Ato's reflection, one of the techniques that's used in lawfare and turns to fascism is the abuse of language to present as in some cases emancipatory language that actually cherry picks the past and can actually brutalize the dignity of the human being. Briefly, because we have others here as well, I would just like to make a brief remark. The first one is I was in conversation with Jane Anna Gordon, who wrote one of the endorsements, the blurbs for this book. And we were having a reflection on intellectuals. And the reflection is that, unfortunately, many intellectuals today, the model that many people are using, not only in the academy, but a lot of political life, is the concept of peaking. And the thing that many don't understand is that such market-oriented terms, marketability, whether you peak, whether you're, etc., miss the point. You see, if you think about all great intellectuals, if you think throughout history, none ever peaked. And they never peaked because their life projects always exceeded themselves. When I remarked earlier that Professor Ato Sekyi-Otu is eternally young because he was old when he was young, and he's young when he gets older, it's because he doesn't peak because his task is infinite. When we think about that, this is what's implicit in a conception of value across the ages. In my afterword, I opened up with a Asante proverb, which simply says, if you carry the egg basket, do not dance. And in the afterword, I talked about how we need to understand how we rethink, for instance, concepts that have been brought into ill repute under neoliberalism and neoconservatism, such as dialectics, concepts such as liberation, revolution. You see, in moments of crisis, and we are in a moment of crisis, there's always the question of a decision to be made. And some people who are frightened about the responsibilities for making decision leap into the bosom of the past and valorize traditions in such a way that they cherry pick it, and they become so closed that we forget that part of being a human being is possibility. The reflection, for instance, right now on these awful laws that are militating against the dignity, the freedom, the respect of LGBTQ peoples that we're seeing not only in Africa but other parts of the world are an effort to create a false notion of the past that ultimately forget that what every generation has always faced, as Fanon pointed out, is the mission of articulating its humanity through the action that builds possibility. And so I just want to read very briefly just one paragraph from my afterword, because one of the problems today is a distortion of how to use the notion of leftism. Leftism has been ossified in some areas to the point where it closes off the communicative practices through which we could build better futures. So very briefly, I just want to read from page 262. And here's what I wrote. The leftism of which Sekyi-Otu speaks is a form of love for the freedom of others, with the understanding that oneself is also an other. The universalism, however, is not as it may appear, since there is an underlying critique of isms. If we return to the dialectical argument, and in Ato Sekyi-Otu's work, he reminds us always that dialectics are open. Okay? It should be clear that there's a distinction between universal and universalizing. To seek the universal is to seek a thing. To universalize is to reach beyond the self. But since humanity is always in the making, the project of universalizing is an ongoing commitment of self-transcendence. The return of the earlier observed universalizing is at play here, but it is done always with humility and a commitment marked by love. The love, the intellectual's work, the teacher, the person who understands what it is to be the student, is the one who understands that every generation also brings unique experiences from which both the elder and the student, the younger, learn together. And this text is a celebration of that love. So I would like at this point, if we could come back to the screen, that we can have, thank you, we can have Gamal and Sophia. Perhaps you would like to say something. And if there are others who are online, like Nigel, because with Ato's wonderful words, we now have the remaining half hour for additional reflections.
Okay, I can say a few things. First of all, thank you everyone for coming from across the globe. This is a particularly honorable time. I want to start off just by thanking everyone and also acknowledging the territories upon which I am situated, to acknowledge the unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the other First Nations people for having cared for the lands across Canada, and in particular in Vancouver, since time out of mind. And I look forward to working with them in partnership as we continue to build the city together, and other cities across Canada, and with other Indigenous peoples across the world. I want to take a moment to give special thanks to our contributors. So Gamal, of course, Stefan Kipfer, Patrick Taylor, Sophie McCall, Jeremy Glick, Nigel Gibson, Jeff Noonan, Esteve Morera, Tyler Gasteiger, Olúfémi, Susan Dianne Brophy, Nergis Canefe, and Christopher Balcom, and of course, Lois Gordon for the afterword. Your contributions are what led to coming together of this book and for allowing us to put this seminal piece into the world. I also want to take a moment to thank all the SPT students, the graduate students who put together the original conference that then led to the creation of this project. So for all those who participated and who spearheaded that conference, thank you. Of course, the work of Ato Sekyi-Otu is, now memorialized through his works. Of course, the work, his initial work that we often refer to, which is Fanon's Dialectic of Experience, and Left Universalism, and going through the contributions and making sense of a lot of the things that the contributors put forward, the writers put forward. I learned so much, and as a new academic in the field, I've recently finished my PhD, and now as an educator in the Faculty of Education, looking towards how this work can be used and mobilized as we look at curriculum documents and as we look at how we can integrate this work into our re-understanding or rewriting and reworking of existing curriculum and pedagogy in Canada is really, really important to me. And that's what I'm looking forward to doing with this text and with the writing of Professor Ato Sekyi-Otu. It is important that we continue to celebrate him, and I think we're very lucky and privileged that he is still with us and that we can continue to dialogue with him. I want to give a special thank you to Gamal for honoring me with this position, to see me as worthy of working with all of you and putting together this piece. So I'll now put it forward to him. Thank you, everyone.
Go ahead, Gamal. You should unmute.
Thank you. Thank you, Sophia. Thanks to all of you. Thank you to Atu. I mean, I don't really have a lot to say. Atu told me not to be modern, so I'm going to follow his advice here. I mean, the conference, as we all know, was an honor to put forward. I mean, it was something that I don't know, I just felt compelled to do. And I felt like Atu's work wasn't getting it seemed to coincide. I mean, Atu's work was not perhaps getting the attention it deserved, and coincidentally, Left Universalism came out just before I had the idea of the conference. The impetus, obviously, for the conference, as people like Louis will know, is that the idea of honoring elders should be fundamental to our practice, and it shouldn't be something that we neglect. It should be some kind of like our first duty, if you will. And it should be, I mean, that is, if you will, the lesson of COVID, for example. To me, one of the main things we should have learned from the first COVID problem is that, we kind of cast our elders aside into these old age homes, and they suffer immensely. And my thinking was that shouldn't be done. As you know, it's not just about that. I mean, I've had deep respect and love for Atu, and it's been going on I mean, we've known each other for, it seems like forever. And I always remember that first, our first meetings and that course. And I just remember somebody who was extremely generous, extremely compassionate, actually. And from somebody who didn't come from a university kind of family, it was very, he was kind of a lifeline, really, for me. Especially given that I wasn't, in my family, you were supposed to become a doctor, like Feroz's family, probably, or a dentist or whatever. But to do philosophy, you weren't supposed to do that, right? So Ato was kind of an uncle to me and was always there. And, and I just felt like my whole project was to really pay him back. And I obviously took forever to do so, but I as I thought about it, I thought, this is what has to be done. And the same thing, of course, occurred in the conference. Conference, as we all know, was a huge success. And then, I feel strongly that the book will be also a huge success. I have to thank all the contributors. They were all gracious, all generous, extremely cooperative, and they put together incredible pieces. And, you can buy it from wherever you buy it. Feroz will tell us where we're supposed to buy it, right? And there's an ebook too available, right? So there's that. There it is. There you go. And I just have one thing to say, which is that really when I think about Ato, and I was thinking about this morning, because Feroz kind of scared me yesterday. He said, "Oh, you have to make remarks. You have to make remarks." And I thought, okay, what am I going to say? There's so much to say, what to say in 5 or 10 minutes, right? But the one thing that if I were to sit there and think about how to boil it down would be, Ato always told me over and over again is that you have to read everyone. And he told me over and over again, and it really wasn't really clear as to why. Initially when I heard that, I just went ahead and tried to read everyone too, but in a way he was, warning or encouraging me against this kind of narcissism, against, if you will, the dual narcissism that Fanon talks about. One is the narcissism of identity, the other is the narcissism of, let's say, colonialist universalism or false universalism, right? And reading everyone is, of course, it may or may not be rewarded, like, as Taiwò's remarks at the beginning suggested, but it certainly lends to a broader conception of humanity. And the fact is that no one is 100% right and no one is 100% wrong. We must read as widely as we can, and everything, as Ato told me a couple of years back, is all philosophy is a kind of idioms of the human condition. So we need to keep that in mind and bear that in mind. And reading everyone makes us somewhat humble. We shouldn't necessarily close doors and say, "Oh, Freud's not worth reading." And people go on and say things categorically that so-and-so is not worth reading, etc., which are, they don't really lead to anywhere. Really, if anything, they lead, narcissism in a way, which is what we've been sort of talking about in some of the remarks, leads to a kind of melancholy, right? A kind of sadness, because you cut yourself off from the world. And Ato's great lesson to me, and this is what I will remember forever, is that basically that was his lesson to me, and he's taught it through Frantz Fanon, he taught it through Marx, he taught it through Aimé Césaire, etc., and through his own work, obviously. And so that's all I will say. And I'm grateful, and it's an honor to be here, and it's an honor to be on this panel with these esteemed people, and it's an honor to do good by my esteemed professor and beloved mentor. So thank you, Ato, and thank you for everything.
Thank you, Gamal. I should add that an unusual element of this meeting is that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 winners of the Frantz Fanon Award on the screen. And Ato's work played a very important role in the in what led to not only the Caribbean Philosophical Association and many associations across the globe, but also this point about being valued by our communities. And one of the things I love about Ato's work is that it challenges the problematic not out of Africa thesis. In a way, the presentation he just made is connected to this ridiculous idea that somehow, although humanity began in Africa, this ridiculous notion that ideas had to be imported in. But ideas that transform and that continue. Africa is the human condition as every other part of the world is. And a lot of and Fanon, Femi, Ato, and now I'm going to ask Michael to say something, because the remarks I'm making are in key with a lot of the important work Michael's been doing, not only in this volume, but also elsewhere. So Michael and then Nigel, would you like to say something?
Okay, thank you so much, Louis. I have been following the comments that have been made with great interest, and I've been a long time fan of Ato Sekyi-Otu's. In fact, we discovered not that long ago that we were on the same wavelength on a whole number of issues. And I just wanted to say a couple of words. First, to pick out a sentence from his contribution to this particular volume, which goes as follows: "We must subject all our beliefs and conventions to the searchlights made available by forms of thought and practice that are, when all is said and done, humanity's commons." Now, for me, this is a superb statement, and I was reminded of it recently in relation to thought that was emanating from working people. And this particular instance from working people from Ato's part of the world, namely the Cape Coast. As most of you probably know, there are still many fishermen on the Cape Coast who engage in what probably would be called small-scale fishing activities. But they collaborate and they throw nets into the sea, and when they pull the nets in, they sing syncopated songs, and some of their songs make very, very critical comments about state oppression. And apparently, I was told that they've been coerced by government into, which has been reacting in Africa very frequently to the coronavirus by coercing people into, or locking them up, or locking them down, as they say, or therefore making it more and more difficult for them to engage in their activities to simply survive and subsist. So one of the syncopated rhythms which was related to me recently was, I can't do this, but the rhythm was they were singing along words which said, "Coronavirus, colonial bylaws, coronavirus, colonial bylaws." And it seemed to me that was absolutely superb critique of state coercion today and linking it with colonial bylaws. And it seems to me that we can learn a lot from the way ordinary people think when they resist forms of oppression. And these forms of resistance, what Ato in his second book calls what was this? How do you put it? The way our grandmothers state it. Various proverbs he's referring to, and he says our grandmother's statements, and he's referring to universalistic statements. It is important to, for me, as it is for Ato, to learn as much as we possibly can from the thought emanating from what we used to call the masses, no longer fashionable term, because it seems to me that thought often provides a context for perhaps the more critical and sophisticated discourses which we come out with as professional academics. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Neocosmos. Because of technical difficulties, we've lost Nigel, but perhaps Sophie McCall would like to say something.
Should I mute?
Yeah. Yes, if you could mute. Sophie, would you like to say something? And then I'll make a remark, and then Feroz will conclude us. Oh, I think, Sophie, you would have to unmute. I think.
You said there's some technological difficulties.
Oh, there's some technological difficulties. Well, one of the things I'd like to just say briefly is this point about valuing those who value us. One of the Fanon Award winners, Glenn Coulthard, wrote a book on a critique of the dialectics of recognition. And as we know, there's a whole industry around this question of recognition that sets the condition of recognition that undermines the value of what is offered by our own communities and what it is also to value the idea of ourselves, not only as sources of value, but the very communicative practice of transcending the narrow conceptions of colonizer-colonized relations. Quite often, this question of reaching out, I've characterized as an act of radical love. And what I mean by that is that, you see, we've talked, as Gamal brought up, about narcissism. And narcissism basically says, I could only love you if you're a mirror of me. But as we know, human beings have the capacity to love those who are not identical with ourselves. We also face a complex political question over the ages, which is that the subsequent generations, those to come, those even when we build institutions of power, such as government or societal organizations, ultimately power reaches those who are anonymous. And their anonymity, the generations to come, they should have the freedom to live as what is meaningful for them. And this is one of the challenges we have right now, because even when we talk about Black Lives Matter, what some people fail to see is that Black Lives Matter is a demand for democracy. It's ultimately not saying only Black Lives Matter. It's saying the times in which Black lives did matter at all need to become the past. But in saying this, it means that we reach beyond ourselves and understand that through this act of commitment, this act in which we continue to build, there will be generations who could come along and say those very powerful words, "Thank God you acted." When I talked about this question of not peaking, what I mean by that is that Ato never stopped to say, I'm going to look at my laurels or the past, look what I've done. He came in this moment to talk about an urgent crisis. an issue of today. Because as we know, the humanity to come, they will be descended from us. But you can be rest assured, they will not be us. They have to be a form of themselves in which we can have the humility to say they are also us. And that also, that act of love, is something that we meet today, and we reach out, and we know that should this moment, these words, this book, and so much other examples survive, that would be that gift of that continued meaning of aluta continuing. The struggle continues. And with that said, I will now leave the conclusion to Feroz Manji, because this is not only organized by Daraja Press, but Daraja Press itself is an exemplification of that act of love. Because what else is our effort as intellectuals, but also our effort as teachers who are also students, who are offering for subsequent generation the challenge to take on the efforts we have brought forth. So Feroz, the screen, and the concluding remarks are yours.
Well, first of all, to say thank you, Lewis. As always, you have a knack of capturing the key elements that comes out of Ato's work as well as your own, and of all the people who are around this table. Because if it isn't about love, what is it about? It can only be that. And it's not it can't be simply a universalist love, I believe. It has to be a partisan one. And I think that's one of the key messages that I take from Ato, because that's the screwed up world that we are currently living in. And it is only through partisanship that we will create the conditions for freedom. And I think this relates to a conversation I had with Gamal yesterday about the difference between academics and intellectuals. And that is that academics build walls and hide behind them. And the task of intellectuals is to demolish those walls and to think about freedom and emancipation. And I think that is really what we have tried to do in the projects with the authors and other collaborators on Daraja Press. But I think I would like, with your permission, Lewis, to ask for the last word from Ato. For it is he and his contribution that we are celebrating now.
Absolutely. Ato, the screen is yours.
One more time. Well, I can only thank you again. I've been resisting doing any more writing, but with this kind of encouragement, maybe I will. Maybe I'll start all over again. And yeah, especially living where I am, and Femi has alluded. You cannot stop but think and write and quarrel. There's so much in everyday life that, quite frankly, pisses you off. I'm about to complete a book of some of them long epigrammatic reflections. I was telling Gamal on everything that pisses me off. And trust me, it's a lot. But a part philosophical, part just current affairs, and lot concerns what the religious elites are doing with interpretations of our and now chiefs those ex-collaborators in the slave trade now trying to profit from turning, sites of the slave trade into tourist centers. You probably have heard of the year of return. And now there is after the return. And some smart character, is erecting monumental buildings along my hometown, Cape Coast. And a key thing, the holiest of holy sport when our brothers and sisters come to visit is called the Royal Place of Return. The Royal Place of Return. I mean, this site of traumatic separation now being turned into the return of ex-monarchs come to reclaim their thrones. It's obscene. Well, the very place where the Cape Coast dungeon is called Cape Coast Castle. What could be more obscene? Cape Coast Castle. So now there is this, our new corporate hustlers are planning to turn the place where our brothers and sisters from the diaspora, a weeping wall where they come to weep. They're turning this into a source of profit. It is sad, very sad. I knew when I was going back home that it wasn't going to be a party. But I didn't know it was going to be so really challenging, morally challenging every single day, every single encounter. But I'm reminded of a powerful phrase in what was in Césaire, the protagonist, planning to return not to paradise, but to the deserted hideousness of your wounds. It's a powerful line in the Notebook, returning to the deserted hideousness of your wounds. If you think of returning in that sense, not of course as the Messiah, the healer, but to join in the work, the collective concerted work of healing ourselves, both those who were there and those who were outside. That is work worth contemplating and pursuing. Thank you.
Thank you, Ato. Thank you. And to everyone who is viewing, continue being safe. Sorry?
We have a few comments, one from Jeremy MG. Much respect and wishes for safety and wellness to all. Thanks Gamal and Sophia for including me, and Gamal for Dakar Children's Book recommendation. Thank you, Ato, for your work, example, and peace. We have Stefan Kipfer. Thank you all for your thoughtful interventions, and thanks to Gamal and Sophia for bringing us together to revisit Ato's work at the conference and through this wonderful book collection. And finally, Crystal B, congratulations to Gamal, Sophia, and all the contributors to the book and to the conversation today, and of course to Ato for all his work and generosity. I'd like to thank all of you for your time, for participating. We're going to end with a little tune from the wonderful Amira Keir, and please don't sign up. It would be nice to have a quick conversation with you once we've ended the broadcast. So love to you all, and we will speak again soon.
Thank you.